Is everyone able to hear my audio? Okay, all right, because sometimes I have trouble. Welcome everyone. It's so nice to see all of you here for another reading group session. Today, we are reading David Graeber's Beyond the Monastic Self, an unpublished manuscript. I think if I'm not mistaken, it appeared in a Japanese translation of the Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology. I think that's the only place that it's appeared in publication. It's a short piece, it's only 10 pages. And like a lot of David's work, it's a think piece that really leaves its implications up to the reader, where he concludes with a lot of questions, where he challenges the readers to think through the implications of some of the arguments that he makes. And so it's in this spirit that I want to begin by providing just a brief overview of what I take to be the central claims of the piece. And then I'll hand it over to Sevda, who's going to launch into a discussion of what these arguments suggest for a number of important topics related to consciousness, the unconscious, and specifically to linguistics. So I'll do an overview, I'll hand it over to her, and then she'll really suggest a lot of the questions based on some interesting theoretical implications of this piece that relates to work that Sevda is hoping to do in graduate school. So let me start with a overview. So like a lot of David's work, it really turns on what it means to be human. And by that, he means, what does it mean to be conscious of oneself and simultaneously to be in community with other people? And what he lays out is that humans are engaged in conversation, or what he calls an interpenetration of minds, that neuroscientists have shown happens when identical neuronal configurations happen in the two brains of people, in the brains of two people engaged in conversation. So he's looking beyond anthropology and basing some of these implications off of some work being done by cognitive psychologists or cognitive neuroscientists, and what this might mean about how humans understand themselves in the world. And there are a couple, I think, central arguments that he makes. So one of them is this idea that if ideas emerge from our relations with one another and from conversations, then it's really not, it's not really possible to talk about there being great thinkers, only thinkers who are in conversation with one another. And David calls this dialogic emergence of ideas. He takes that idea and teases out a further implication, which he begins by suggesting that all existing theory is based on misapprehension. And he argues this by referring to some work by cognitive neuroscientists who talk about how our thinking, our conscious self-reflective thought, doesn't mainly happen in the head. It happens, but nor does it happen merely in our relations with the material environment. Consciousness exists mainly in the concrete junctures between what have sometimes been called embodied personalities. And this idea, to me, sounds very familiar to one that he suggested in another piece that we read, the Turning the Modes of Production Inside Out, where he says that it's really not possible to talk about there being individuals, that really people are nothing more than the accretions of social relations that they have. So if we think about consciousness as being something that's constructed collectively, then it really doesn't make sense to talk about there being a single great thinker responsible for single ideas, although in the course of history, especially the intellectual history of philosophy, that's often how these stories get narrated. And he goes with a further implication, again drawn from cognitive neuroscience, that what we consider to be consciousness is often a misunderstanding of consciousness, and that neuroscientists are suggesting over the last decade or so that what we describe as consciousness is really just a window of consciousness, and that true consciousness itself, that, well, he says we cannot keep more than a few seconds of perceptual experience in short-term memory at any given time. So the width of our conscious window on the world may be no more than 2 seconds wide. And the implications of this are, I think, quite profound, because it not only challenges us to erase any idea of there being singular great thinkers, but also that the process of conversation, the practice rather of conversation, really is what makes these fleeting moments of consciousness. So there isn't an isolated, self-sufficient, rational, self-reflective intellect. And if one goes back in time to study philosophy over a long period of time, we find that a lot of the philosophers who are sort of assumed to be the originators of philosophy, Socrates, etc., that this is an idea that they held, and that philosophy didn't start with the idea of a rational individual, but really started with the idea of a telos, of an ideal endpoint, which is comes about as the result of a process of engaging in conversation. And what he argues is that over time, philosophy as a discipline shifted from dialogic process or practice to an academic pursuit. And it went from being a communal collective exercise to being one that was done by a few individuals. And that's what he means by the monastery, sort of an isolated group of monks pursuing intellectual life. And that from there, it went from the monastery to the university, and that what has been lost in the process is really a shrinking of our imaginative understandings of what constitutes philosophical practice, that the philosophy is the practice. And this is something that David finds resonance in the work of distributed cognition, the idea that thinking takes place not strictly inside the head, but outside the individual's head, who sort of offloads different aspects of thinking to others. But that philosophy over time has come to concentrate more and more on the machinery of the process, or the technological aspect of the process. And this is what really the university is. The university now is this extension of a thinking machine that is really a house for great thinkers, rather than what David is suggesting is a dialogic process to begin with. So the self-conscious individual has been created through this disciplinary technique of isolation and reflection. And that isolation and reflection is really the process one goes through in graduate school, where great amounts of time are spent in solitude poring over the works of so-called great thinkers, and that it has really destroyed our idea of a collective kind of consciousness or cosmic unity. And David points out that there are very few philosophers who have really started from this point of non-dualism, and that Bhaskar is one, but that the few who do have at least in his case, have abandoned academia because this kind of idea is really antithetical to the great thinker model of the university. So he ends up arguing that our existence as intelligent beings is made possible by an endless variety of everyday experiences that occur between embodied personalities rather than between some abstract or artificially created self and cosmos. So that dualism between self and cosmos, David is looking to rupture. And philosophy has lost a sense of itself by abandoning that kind of non-dualism. And it ends up putting us in a position where the most basic forms of exploitation seem to be the result of a process where the coming together individuates oneself at the expense of another. So not only is there this false distinction made between self and cosmos, but that distinction helps reinforce exploitative forms of or social relations of oppression, because one can be individuated at the expense of the other. Whereas if we tried to imagine a strange state somewhere in between individuation and empathy and non-existence, that would have some profound implications for the way we understand ourselves as social creatures in the world, and which would then have, of course, deep implications for philosophy, for politics, and for wage relations, for what constitutes work and how work gets done. So his argument, of course, rests on this premise of non-dualism. So if one rejects the idea of non-dualism, then the argument falls apart. But if we start from the premise of non-dualism, then there is this way of imagining politics and philosophy and science in new ways that hasn't been done historically in the Western tradition because of this reliance on dualism. So I'm going to hand it over to Sevda, who's going to give us some insights into what this might suggest for notions of the unconscious and for linguistics.
Hello, you hear me, right? Okay. Thank you, Stephen, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about ideas and assumptions which require thorough research and loads of reading. I have been obsessed with these ideas for a very long time and intend to work on them on my master degree thesis. So these are not these are raw what I'm going to say are raw materials, so please do not take it seriously. So I hope we just can have a conversation here, so we can end up with something good. Just give me a second, please. So Without language, we don't have consciousness. This is what I understand from the essay or the manuscript. When I first read the manuscript, I thought David, however, indirectly is referring to the unconscious as well as consciousness, or what he calls the collective consciousness. I want to draw on the importance of language and how we can find traces of the origin of the language through what is going to be collective unconsciousness, and how language can be a door to find answers to some of our unanswered questions, like where are we from, and where are we going. So the linguistic side of this essay is that I want to start by quoting David's sentence that he said, almost all existing social theories are based on misapprehension. And I totally agree. In a sense that, I'm sorry again, I'm the worst presenter. So I want to understand this sentence, I want to talk about a little about the relationship between human beings and their bodies. And it is suggested that a human person is constituted by his body. So there is a distinction in human person and a living body. So there are two distinctive words to define them. We know that the mind is not a kind of entity. The talk of the mind is no more than an abstraction from our talk of human beings. Their intellectual, volitional abilities and exercise, and parallel to that, the talk of our body is in a like manner derivative from our talk of human beings. In a sense, which a body is a material, spatio-temporal continuum. Of course, human beings are bodies. But although this is a quasi-technical use of body and it's a general term, material, spatio-temporal continuums may be inanimate or animate. Those that are animate are organisms of varying degrees of biological complexity. Human beings are highly complex organism, and in this sense, too, are bodies. Being a body in this sense, being an organism, implies being a body in the most general sense. So here I try to emphasis on the distinctive of the distinctiveness of the human person and the living body. When there is there can be a question, what's the relationship with the mind and the body? The mind-body problem is insoluble. It's a remainder of the Platonic, Augustinian, Cartesian tradition. It cannot be solved, but it can be dissolved. It's a very very powerful statement. I read in a book. So I can recommend it later to you. The mind is not an entity that could stand in a relationship to anything else. The body that a human being is, it just, we can look at this sentence. The body that a human being is. Most of the English speakers may not be really, maybe they are just speakers of the language, but if grammatically we take this just notice in the grammar of this sentence, it gives us so much information. The body that a human being is, it's so much for me, it's a roller coaster kind of thing experience when I just give this when I read this sentence. So the body that a human being is, the living organism, has and exercises those distinctive intellectual and volitional abilities that we speak of when we speak of people's mind. So so far I think I'm so boring. Just give me a sign if I'm not boring, please. So the unconscious, I want to give this little on introduction that as the unconscious, Lacan is one of the very most famous psychoanalysts of our time, and this is the unconscious is structured like a language. What does it mean? Like, have you ever dreamed that you wake up and you cannot how do you say, explain it or describe your dream to someone else because it has yet to be in the symbolic order, so we cannot explain it or express it or describe it. And the symbolic order is like a snake swirling around its prey. It swirls around all those the unconscious and try to transfer it from the unconscious to the conscious. So it's really interesting that that the unconscious, as Lacan puts it, is structured like language. So why not to think that the unconscious is the this is the a foundation where all the human life is built on, from the unconscious to the conscious, and all the chains, as we can say, to the collective unconscious, to the collective consciousness. This is so. I mean, what I want to say is that the unconscious, the collective unconsciousness, is where we can find many of our unanswered questions. Like it's a mysterious place where there are still yet to be found, let's say, and so, and I want to give an example to make it a bit clearer. Have you seen the movie 2001: Space Odyssey? I hope you do, but okay. There is a spatial temporal object called monolith. It resembles nothing in the world, right? So that monolith. So when those great apes, they were having the very ordinary day of their life. So then they find out there is a monolith landed on the surface of Earth, and they became so aggressive, and they learned how to throw a bone. So not only until that time, not the bone is thrown. They don't know how to use that bone. They don't know that the bone, they can use it as a weapon to I mean, that monolith can be a representation of the unconscious that gives us the answer, okay, where we are from and where we are going. So we don't know, because in the end of the movie, there is the star child and that monolith just in front of each other. So it wants to give a secret meaning or message that this is what is important. There's something mysterious in this world that we haven't been able to to understand or comprehend it, and yet to be comprehended. Someone is want to come in. I want to admit. Sorry. Yeah. And the unconscious mind, and I hope the linguistic part wasn't that boring, or I hope, and I gave good points. So the thing is that when David says that all the social theories are based on misapprehension, is right about the philosophers, though social theories and philosophy are interconnected. So we can say it to kind of social theories and philosophy as well at the same time. So Wittgenstein, a very important linguist, he says that says that about philosophy, that the philosophers didn't understand language itself and the laws that govern it, the laws of the language. So a lot of misunderstanding happened. Misunderstanding led to another misunderstanding, and the chain led to misapprehension. So the philosophers, if understood the language well, so there wouldn't be these complex questions and answers, and yet a misunderstanding of that. So taking all these things all together, like why I say collective unconsciousness, Carl Jung, another psychoanalyst, I didn't know that the term existed. I just happened to Google it and I found out that, yeah, there is a collective unconsciousness. I had this idea that there is something mysterious in our experience, our daily experience. And you see that we have, on some levels, we know things when we're born, like a kid know how to get fed by her mother or his mother, or a cat, just a kitten, they never, and how to say it in English, they only piss on the soil, right? They never do it on somewhere else. It's just a very funny kind of example, but just take it into account. How does this kitten know without being taught that he or she that should do that on a soil? So Carl Jung coined the term collective unconsciousness, and the hypothesis of a collective unconsciousness belongs to the class of ideas that people at first find strange, but soon come to possess and use a familiar conceptions. Like at the first, the concept of conscious was limited to denoting the state of repressed or forgotten contents. And as the years go by, the collective unconsciousness becomes not personal but universal, that we all share. In contrast to the personal psyche, it has contents and modes of behavior that are more or less the same everywhere and in all the individuals. So why not think that language is the unconscious? So digging into the language and digging into the unconsciousness can lead us to something which I say getting answers to our unanswered questions, maybe. And so that is, I mean, this is a very short introductory things I've thought about the essay, and these are those ideas that I was been curious about for a long time, that I still am. I hope I presented well, which I think I didn't. But if you have any question, I'm happy to answer your questions.
I have a question. So
Yes.
if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, you're saying that idea of a collective unconsciousness isn't this collective other kind of unconscious, but it's just that relational aspect that Graeber is talking about in his essay, right? Am I understanding that right?
To answer your question is that, have you ever had this experience when you were thinking about a friend and you suddenly, maybe you get a text or a phone call or a mention of his or her name.
Mm-hmm.
Has it happened to you, or I don't know, So collective unconsciousness has led to the collective consciousness that in that very short time when we have a conversation, our minds are set as one. So and this is through communication, and communication is through language. So language is important. So, and by digging into it, we can find answers.
And I think if I understand correctly, Sevda, when you ask, is language the unconscious? It seems that you're suggesting that there, especially in your allusion to Jung, that there is a collective unconscious that humans have, and that language is what allows us to step into that unconscious. And so what I'm curious about is, so language is a symbolic order. So does that mean that the unconscious, if language is the unconscious, does that also mean that the unconscious is a symbolic order?
The unconscious, in order to get into the conscious or the symbolic order, I mean, it is through the symbolic order. As I gave the example of the dream, you wake up a dream and you cannot describe the dream because it has no meaning. You have seen pictures, images, right, in your dreams, but you cannot explain it because it has not yet been in the symbolic order. So yeah, what is in the deep must come to the surface. That's how I put it.
Okay, so yeah, it would seem then that, not unlike what David Graeber has argued elsewhere, especially drawing on Terence Turner, that the meaning is the order, that which is sort of what he's suggesting by this dialogic process or practice, that the practice itself is the cohering of order, and that the meaning comes out of the coherence that happens as I love this illusion of the symbolic order being a snake that circles around the unconscious, and that it's sort of always circling, and that there are these fleeting, or there are these efforts to create the meaning and order, but it's always done in relation to one another, if I understand this correctly.
After the unconscious in the symbolic order, you know, we have this linguistics understanding, like morphology, syntax, and semantics, right? And these are different from the, this is the linguistics, theoretical linguistics, let's say. And yeah, somehow what you said is right, but we should know that like the mirror stage of children, not until that stage they think they cannot distinguish themselves from other entities and objects around themselves. So in that stage, they start creating that symbolic order. So, and that individuation of the language and that strength of that language becomes to say, I am, I did it. You know, the kids love that. And yeah. Yes, please.
Well, it may be less a question to you, but rather a kind of contribution to the conversation. Mm-hmm. Overall. First of all, I have to say that I still don't know David's work good enough, but I 100% enjoyed the reading, although I did it very quickly. And this also for two personal reasons. one personal reason is that in my master work many years ago, I worked also with Hutchins' concept of distributed cognition, and with some linguistic texts about how the activity is structured and how let's say the meaning making happens among the individuals, because I studied a specific game which Nika for sure knows. It's a game called in Russian "Что, где, когда," what, where, when, and the point is that there are teams of 5 or 6 people, I don't remember, and they have to answer a question within a minute. So technically what I did a detailed transcription of verbal and non-verbal conversation which happens during this minute. And then I analyzed how this, let's say, distributed mind works to find a solution. Well, I don't go into the details, but so this is like one personal thing where I kind of worked in this similar direction. And then in my PhD, I worked on do it yourself and how people engage with the material world. And I was interested, first of all, in this kind of question. And just like David described, I abandoned this strategy because it was too dangerous. And I realized that if I would go in this direction, I will be somewhere between psychology, cognitive science, anthropology, linguistics, and then it's just not going to be doable. And there was no literature that I could engage clearly so that I could construct a coherent narrative. So at the end of the day, I end up writing it in a completely different way, although these kind of questions always kind of kept puzzling me. And the only work which I found interesting and in a way answering or thinking in the same direction was the work by French anthropologist Varnier, who tried in his work, so it's to marry, let's say, the French school of ergonomics. And so the French school there were different people calling it in different ways, but technically these were anthropologists working on material stuff, and a lot of ergonomics and anthropotechnology, they called it, and the Foucauldian analysis. So basically what he was trying to say that the subject is is of course a discursive subject, so according to Foucault, but at the same time it's a subject which emerges through the engagement with the material world. And this was the line like coming from this French school of sociology and anthropology. It was Merleau-Ponty and some other people. And he was, I think he's still, well, of course he has his place and so on, but he was also criticized that it's still not very coherent and anything, but I think it's an interesting work to think with if you are interested also to read further in this direction. And I think it was also an interesting suggestion kind of to move away from psychology, because I think that psychology is really, let's say, a dangerous field for social sciences, because in social sciences, we still need kind of to work with the practices. And I think it's very interesting that Sevda kind of went into the direction of not even social psychology, but psychoanalysis, which is a very different ground. And it requires very different methodology. And in this case, you don't even work with the language as a practice. So as, for example, Levinson would do, or conversational analysis people would do, or sociolinguists would do. So it's something completely different. Yeah, and I think I don't have a coherent conclusion right now, but these were like different thoughts and bits that I wanted to share. And maybe one question to those who know David's work better. Do you know whether he planned to engage, because I assume it's an unfinished work, right? So I wonder if he also planned working with this concept of individuals which used to be very popular in anthropology some years ago, based on some data from Malaysia. So basically the point of this individuals concept was to go away from individuals and to say that the conception of personality can be different. Yeah.
For the part of the psychoanalysis, I think about those people who has psychosis or language problems as the result of psychosis, and those people who take drugs, who have those people are closer to their unconscious than like on drug person, because in psychosis people tend to use a language really different, and so that will be methodology to conduct the research, and that's why I think they are related. People with psychosis, language, and the unconscious.
Maybe I very quickly say, so I personally find it problematic to use the concept of unconsciousness as it was something fixed and clear. I mean, it's the concept itself, I think, is problematic, and maybe for those working inside the school of psychoanalysis, it's all clear and you can use it as just a shared term. But for me as an anthropologist, it's not the term that I can use because it's highly problematic. We cannot say what is conscious, we cannot say what is unconscious. So just referring to the unconsciousness for me doesn't really make sense. I also assume that in linguistics it also very differently in different branch of linguistics, because linguistic drawing on Wittgenstein would definitely never use unconsciousness as a fixed term.
Can I say something, Kenneth, before you step in? Yeah, I agree with you that the unconscious is not a fixed thing. That's why I said it's mysterious. I like the mysterious nature of the unconscious. Starting from the Lacan, what Lacan says that the unconscious is structured like language, doesn't mean that it is language, but the structure, the use of the structure and the understanding of the language as Wittgenstein tries to explain it, that probably helps, but that's and I think it requires a thorough research and loads of reading. That's why I kept it in my thesis, master thesis. Yeah, Kenny, you can jump in.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to share an insight that was just surfaced by Zinaida's thoughts, and then I wanted to pose a question for everyone, if that's okay.
Yeah.
First, the insight that came out of the dialogue. While listening to Zinaida, she had sort of ended on an apology that I'm sorry if I'm incoherent right now, and something clicked right at that moment that was surfaced by the reading, or came to me in the course of the reading, but was surfaced by what Zinaida said. Maybe there's something to be said about posing a binary or a contrast between coherence on one hand, this notion that when we say something, it has to be it has to make internal sense, versus cogence. And by cogence, I mean this idea of bringing two worlds together. Like when we say something is cogent, you're saying something that might be incoherent, but you're bringing something to the table that could help bring your world and the world of another person, or perhaps wider worlds, together in this moment. And I think that speaks to the spirit of this essay. And if we can push it to the direction of a provocation even, I think a thought or an argument or an idea can be incoherent yet cogent. Right? Like it might not make internal sense, but hey, yeah, well, that kind of helps me make sense of my own thinking, right? So that's something that was dialogically that came to mind when Zenaida was speaking. The question I wanted to pose to everyone is something of a kind of like a practical prefiguration question, so to speak. Because personally, I already believe that we should really move away from this myth of the heroic author, the heroic author. And I wonder if in our own practices, there are small or big or, like little things that help shift a conversation away from that practice. For instance, even the idea of authorship, right? When we present something or when we write something by so-and-so name, is there a way that we can probably trouble that practice and make it so that it's clear that it's always in conversation? I'm just wondering if this is something that any of you has thought about or is already doing in your own practices. So yeah, thank you.
I think it's Michael's turn. Michael?
Oh, okay, yeah. I know lots of people write books as a collective, not as a, and sometimes they do it as a hidden collective, but actually they're not hiding it. They just write certain books, like the Wu Ming Collective wrote a whole novel on conspiracy theory in the medieval period, and they're actually a group of people, and they'll tell you who they are. But it's an interesting way to trouble the idea of being a single author, which is of course connected with ownership, like I own this type of stuff. I thought Sevda's presentation was great, bringing in the unconscious. My kind of concern with, I think Lacan is good, but it is, at least he's interesting. I guess I would flag out that, like, the idea of the unconscious as something inside the person is maybe what this is. I guess whenever you talk about the unconscious, you still have this idea of what is the unconscious. And so, like a lot of people get like the idea that there's like this little person inside you that's just like another person, except they're kind of angry or whatever, right? And I don't know if that type of idea is quite as much as what would happen when you start thinking about, say, all of the common structures that are in the world, and every human has to interact with them. And so therefore, they're very much influenced them. And obviously language is part of one of those common structures. I know that Andre Green had written, he was a person who's a really interesting psychoanalyst and written about, it was a student of Freud's, student of Lacan's, and had written against the idea that language is structured like an unconscious, right? Because the idea of that structuralism is to say, is a theory when applied by the social sciences, is that you have this, here you can understand language in this particular structural way, and it all resolves, and therefore you can understand the human subject. So, and that arguably, I mean, I'm sure Chomsky would, argues that type of thing, Noam Chomsky, the structuralism of the human subject. And other people have kind of argued that actually it's a bit more differentiated in the structure. Like, so I was kind of curious about how to take, so the symbolic order is not something that's inside people, but it's a symbolic order as something that interacts with people, but they all imagine it or envision it. And in some ways it can be it's still quite a negative thing. Like that image of a symbolic order as a sort of snake that surrounds the individual and attacks them, the symbolic order where people continually like internalize these kind of issues like, oh, look, a tall white man who speaks well and is confident. And so somebody might say, oh, in the symbolic that, and they internalize that, and that becomes a thing. It's interesting to think about what is the the referent for where that so-called symbolic order is stored, or is it just something that people pick up? But I think your stuff is interesting. What I would be interested in this essay is the idea he brings in this cyborg into it, or the idea that we are continuous with the material things around us, which is a kind of concept of the human person working with their material environment. And we have a collective material environment. So much of that material environment becomes the way in which we interact. And I'm not as familiar with Vygotsky. If anybody else is, I thought, because I had to read him once for a teaching course, and I read him enough to get my teaching certificate and then forgot him. But like, I think Vygotsky has a lot of that type of material of how people interact with them. So I'd love to know if anyone has comments on that. And thanks, Sevda, for your great presentation.
Simona?
Too early. I was not ready. This essay made me think of an author I studied at my bachelor studies. That is Arnold Gehlen. It's a German, quite Nazi author, actually, but he influenced a lot Berger and Luckmann, who are two authors who talk about the social construction of reality. And also he influenced Luhmann, Niklas Luhmann. All these authors are working on how human beings build their reality together. And Gehlen, despite being, this is the book, this is the Italian edition. In German, it is Das Mensch seine Platz in das Welt. Very German. And but Gehlen is very interesting, despite his conclusions, because he looks at human beings as at beings that need to build themselves together with their reality, and that cannot do this task without doing it together with other humans. Even self-individuation is made by looking at others. It's a mirror effect in looking to others. And two other very interesting things in Gehlen. That's why I advise you to have a look at this philosopher. That he explains how our concepts are at the same time actions and representations. We cannot think of a cup without making the gesture of taking it mentally. In saying cup, we already think of the gesture of what the hand needs to do to take a cup. And in objects, we already see how we can use them and how we can use them together. The second very interesting concept from Gehlen is that of more life. He assumes that in primitive cultures. He writes in the 30s, so pardon me for this concept of primitive. The magic is done to get more life, to empower, to give more power and more creativity to life. What's very interesting in this philosophy is that on one side, Galen stresses the need for human beings to circumscribe the abundance of stimulus that we get from reality, and the role of other humans in helping us in structuring it. And on the other side, he shows how this we need to keep working on it and to enlarge the world we build. And that's in this operation, we need other humans for this social construction of reality. Sorry for being so long, but this David's text just inspired me on this side.
Matt, you want to say something?
Sure. Yeah, I think for me, what was most interesting was that, again, the social construction, that relational aspect of consciousness and reality. And there's a book I haven't read yet, so this is like a half recommendation because, again, I haven't read it yet. But there's a theoretical physicist, an Italian theoretical physicist named Carlo Rovelli, who just came out with a book called Helgoland, which is about, I think what it's proposing is that in quantum physics, everything, like, there aren't physical things, there's just relationships, even down to like a quantum level. And so if you look at society that way, if you look at everything, like both physical and everything, like, what does that mean if everything is just relationships and not objects? And what does that what does that mean? And how is that even kind of going back to Holloway, like talking about how things are not concrete, they're always in movement and always in action. So like for me, that is probably one of the most interesting that he touches that on a, taking that down from, things are on an outer level, but also on an internal level, that truth is still there.
Thank you. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Kelly.
Hi, yes, it's Kelly. Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation, also for the analysis done and the discussion, which is very, very interesting. I'd like to move back to one of the points made earlier about how to move away from the myth of, heroic authors. And it's true that David is doing it in this text, but not only in this one. And one text that I've been reading lately was about what his work that he's been doing in Madagascar, and also the link to piracy, and how he thinks that this has been the starting point of what we call now the Enlightenment, regarding everything related to democracy. And he challenges the fact that this is, who has fathered that are the Western philosophers, but rather the pirates in some places in our world who had developed practices of democracy. So that's one point. And the second one is I moved to Canada some months ago, and therefore I've been interested in the last months also in Aboriginal teachings. And I started to read about that, to learn also. It's a completely different vision of the world. And when it comes to authors, they have this approach of storytelling, and they never quote authors. And for them, what is said, who said something, or what was meant by what he said, what was said or what he said, is not the most important. What is important is how the reader feels about it, how these link to your thinking, to your feeling, to your doing as the listener or the reader. And I think that's an important approach to take also, which is not really aligned with how we approach this in our Western world. So yeah, that's my small contribution to that discussion at this stage.
Thank you. Robin?
Well, thanks. When I was reading David, firstly, thank you, Sevda. But when I was reading David's paper, I was thinking about mathematics, because if you take something like geometry, almost all mathematicians will agree on the statements of the theorems they work with. So there's a very strong consensus, and that consensus is maintained usually by marks on pieces of paper, by quite specific and precise language. But actually the experience in the mathematician is something in their brain, in their neurons. So it's almost if the very precise language of mathematics is a way of keeping various versions of wetware in people's brains in sync with one another. But in the past, many people had a kind of Platonic view that because everyone agreed on abstract mathematical theorems and so on, they were actually in heaven somewhere in some perfect other realm. But I'm less convinced by that. And I think often it's more a question of internal representations of what's going on, almost kinesthetic in many cases, or visual. But it's interesting how a very precise language keeps those aligned with one another.
Thank you, Robin. Anybody else?
I have a question to everybody. I would like to have a lot of questions, but I think we're already an hour and more. So, and I would like to keep digging in this theme. And so previously we would have these reading groups with every time with the different presentation and different author, and we were all over the place. So now it was an idea to kind of do a small reading group, but dig deeper. So maybe right now we can decide what we're gonna do next time. And ideally I would propose we follow the same theme. I posted in the, so I was thinking maybe we should read Maurice Bloch that is mentioned in this text. The other idea I have is to read something from this book, that is a prolongation of the same conversation about dialogues, and part of this book is quoting even this article that we read today. Or I don't know, Vasily, what maybe something that was already scheduled could be considered as a prolongation of the same train of thought. So we wouldn't lose the thread, because it's very difficult to build in. We also want to read Roy Bhaskar. So it's mostly a question, but Vasily, maybe it's a question to you, because you're the one who was keeping schedule of our reading groups.
The only thing I know for now is that we're gonna have a reading group at the end of August with the group from Milan, Bat Nietzsche for it might be a reading group divided into two sessions, because they want to read Anti-Education, which is a book, so it's quite long. Apart from that, we're gonna have a reading group with Hélène on Marshall Salins, who passed away this year, and he wanted to do something sometime, sometime soon, maybe in the coming month. And then, yeah, then we have like we have another year to come, so we have plenty of opportunities to do that.
I just wanted to say that for this reading group, for me the major question is, I totally lost, is about relationship to the reality, like a real reality. So how all this, yeah, how these different ideas of being human being could affect our view of real world, and that looks like what Roy Bhaskar was talking about mostly. So I would be very interested to read something more about that and to talk about this, because I feel like I kind of like I lost. I don't have any clue, and that's
Yeah, I felt it was actually a difficult text, but much easier if you. I didn't know this text by Maurice Bloch on this theory of mind, reading minds, basically. It's actually quite interesting, and it's a really good starting point to understand what David is actually talking about in this text. So I actually highly recommend to read it before. Maybe maybe we can read actually that sometime soon, so we can have a kind of foundation of what David wants to say, and maybe something about Bhaskar as well, so by Bhaskar as well, or by Andrew Collier, who's actually much easier and actually wrote really useful texts to understand what Bhaskar is talking about.
Would you facilitate one of this reading group, Vasily? And which one would you recommend?
Well, I'm an expert of none of those, but if someone is if someone in the group has expertise in critical realism or cognitive anthropology, then please make yourself known, because that could be actually really. I think it's actually really good to have some people introducing a text on something they actually have knowledge about. But the opposite is actually true as well. I also like that too. Well, anyway, happy to facilitate that. And you were saying something else about yeah. Do we want to talk about these coming sessions now, or do we want to continue our discussion? My question is that do we still have time to talk about the text, this particular text now, or we talk about that later on another reading group?
I just was afraid that we wouldn't be able to cover the questions now, so I was just wanted to schedule a future way of thinking about that. But yes, we can probably talk. Maybe it's will be good if Steven would kind of summarize something, since he started the conversation.
Yeah, what would you like me to summarize?
I don't know, like all this conversation that we had today.
Yeah, I mean, we've sort of touched on a lot of different points, and it gets to Zenaita's point about how there really isn't a discipline in between these other disciplines. And as Kenneth was saying about the issue of authorship, especially because we've gone from a monastery to a university where the world is publish or perish, so much depends on single authorship, because that's what gets one an endowed, that's what gets one tenure and then an endowed chair, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, there's a lot there. Some of the points about Holloway and Matt's comments about how there are no objects, only relations or actions that happen among objects, struck me something similar to Piaget's genetic epistemology, and so that so the implications to structuralism, linguistics, psychoanalysis, there's quite a lot there. I have not read Maurice Bloch's Going In and Out of Bodies. That might be a helpful place. I know that we've been wanting to read Roy Boscar's, and so I don't know if there's a consensus as to the direction that we might go. I certainly do not have an expertise in critical realism. I have just sort of a superficial reading in it. I have an interest in it, but really an amateur interest. So I don't know if I would be the best to facilitate that. I'm happy to help if that's the direction we'd like to go. I'd also be very interested in reading the anarchism, the Diophanes piece, which I've not read. I don't know if there are thoughts on directions that we could go.
I like the Bhaskar as well. I mean, I know nothing about him, but could be a good opportunity for a lot of us to learn.
Yeah, I think we should not lose this chain of thoughts, because during the conversations, there are a lot of new concepts and ideas are presented. So it's fair to continue with that. Like, yeah, for Bhaskar is really good. So it's better to choose the next sessions, like reading material from our conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that point, that I do think that we are working toward this idea of a critique of object-oriented ontology, and trying to find space between materialism and idealism, and how we come to understand ourselves as embodied personalities or accretions of social relations. Not having read either one, I'm seeing in the chat that Bloch may be the better place to begin. So I certainly support that idea. Okay, yeah, we can do the Maurice Bloch. Is there a date that's available for the next reading group?
So the next reading group is supposed to be on the 29th, but then it's the assembly of our guest curatorial team. So maybe we can do it a week after 29, because like in July, like at first Thursday of July, because that's, summertime now. How about that?
In August.
Yeah, you mean August?
August, yeah.
Yeah.
How people feel about that? Yeah.
I like that.
Okay.
So I don't have my calendar. Let's see, here it is. That would be August 5th.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. Are there any volunteers to facilitate? I'm happy to volunteer myself. Also happy to have someone who's an anthropologist help out.
I would be happy to contribute another time, but we're in Germany, we're still in the semester and we are at the end of semester. So which is a little bit, little bit tough. So I would rather postpone my contribution to the fall.
Sure, I can facilitate again as long as you're not getting tired of me.
You could also be a sociologist because it's a bit about Durkheim.
Yeah.
So an expert on Durkheim.
That's not me. I am no expert on Durkheim.
Neuroscience? Okay, it doesn't really matter if we all agree on the text, then it's a good start, and we can exchange emails, and maybe someone will volunteer eventually.
Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you so much, Sevda and Steven. And yeah, it was cool. Also, just last things I said, it's a book that I can send text to everybody, and I also can maybe find a chapter that is more related to the article read today. So some between, we can just look for that book, and we can invite Mehdi to the reading group, and also maybe Asya would join us, another co-author, for the reading group about this book. Okay, so
All right.
yeah, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
See you next time. Bye.
Thank you.